The sun hung low over the endless expanse of the desert, casting a molten gold glow across the rolling dunes. The wind howled with a relentless force, whipping sand into sharp, stinging lashes that cut across the young woman's skin. Each step she took was a battle. Her feet sank into the hot sand, her lungs burned with every breath, and the small bag she carried pressed heavily against her shoulder. She was alone, utterly alone, and with every passing hour, the desert seemed determined to swallow her whole. Her name was Eliza, a traveler of modest means, journeying to a distant settlement to start a new life. But the desert had a way of testing the resolve of even the strongest. Hours before, a sudden sandstorm had erupted without warning, and she had been forced to abandon the path she had memorized. Now, disoriented and exhausted, she stumbled over a ridge, the wind tearing at her thin cloak. Panic gnawed at the edges of her mind. She knew that if she didn't find shelter soon, the unforgiving desert could claim her life. Just as despair threatened to overtake her, a shadow appeared on the crest of the dune. At first, she thought it a mirage, a cruel trick of her fatigued eyes, but the figure moved with unmistakable purpose. The man was tall and imposing, his dark hair whipping around his face, his eyes sharp and calculating. He wore a simple, earth-toned tunic and a blanket slung over his shoulders, yet he carried himself with a quiet authority that made her heart skip. Without hesitation, he extended a hand toward her, his voice steady and calm above the roar of the wind. "Come this way," he called, guiding her to a small depression in the dunes that offered some protection from the storm. Eliza's legs trembled. Barely able to support her weight, but she managed to crawl into the sheltered hollow beside him. The sandstorm raged around them, but within the small pit, it felt as though they were in a separate world, a fragile, temporary sanctuary. She could barely find her voice, whispering her gratitude, but the words seemed lost against the roar of the desert. He merely nodded, his expression calm, almost unreadable, as he draped part of his blanket over her shoulders, shielding her from the abrasive sand. For hours they waited. Eliza couldn't help but study him in the flickering light of the setting sun that seeped through the storm. He moved with careful precision, setting small rocks to block the wind, adjusting the blanket, and keeping a watchful eye on the horizon. It was clear he knew this desert intimately, knew how to read its moods, and more importantly, knew how to survive it. She felt a surge of admiration and fear. He was a stranger, yet he risked his own safety simply to ensure hers. Finally, the storm began to abate, the wind easing into a gentle, mournful whisper. The desert lay quiet once more, and the man offered her a hand to stand. She accepted, her legs weak, and found herself steadied by his firm grip. In that moment, something shifted, something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude was only the surface. Beneath it was a strange, inexplicable connection, the kind forged in moments of danger and shared vulnerability. Before she could speak again, he simply nodded toward the horizon. "The desert is still treacherous," he said. "You need to keep moving, but not alone. I will guide you until it is safe." Eliza looked at him, startled, but there was no room for hesitation. She had no choice but to trust him, and in that trust, the first threads of something deeper began to form. A bond forged in the crucible of life and death, one she would remember forever, even if time and distance tried to pull them apart. As they set off together, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dunes. The desert, vast and merciless, seemed less threatening with him by her side. And although neither spoke of it yet, both sensed that this encounter, this life-saving act, was only the beginning of a story neither of them would ever forget. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a landscape of shimmering heat waves and shifting sand that seemed to stretch to infinity. Eliza stumbled with every step, her strength still wavering from the storm, yet the man beside her never faltered. He moved with a fluid confidence, his feet barely sinking into the sand, every step purposeful. She found herself watching him constantly, his alert eyes scanning the horizon, his hand occasionally brushing against his bow, and the way he seemed perfectly in tune with the land. "You move carefully," she said, trying to distract herself from the fatigue gnawing at her muscles. "How do you know where it's safe?" He glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of amusement passed through his dark eyes. "The desert speaks," he said simply. "Listen, watch, feel. It tells you where danger hides." Eliza laughed weakly, incredulous. "The desert speaks? I hear nothing but wind and sand." He shook his head. "One day you will." Despite the exhaustion, she felt a strange comfort in his presence. The desert had seemed merciless moments ago, a vast and indifferent expanse, yet with him, she felt a measure of safety she hadn't known she needed. Every shadow and ridge seemed less threatening because she wasn't alone. And though she tried to ignore it, a small part of her felt an unfamiliar stir of curiosity and admiration for the man who had saved her life. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, beating down relentlessly. Eliza's throat burned with thirst, her lips dry and cracked, and the small bag she carried offered little sustenance. She faltered, nearly collapsing, but his hand shot out, steadying her before she could fall. "You must conserve your strength," he said, his voice low but firm. "There is a spring not far from here, hidden beneath the rocks. We'll reach it if you can keep moving." She nodded, her pride stung by the reminder of her weakness, yet grateful for his guidance. Together they navigated treacherous dunes, sometimes moving in silence, sometimes speaking in hushed tones. Slowly, she learned to follow his lead, watching the wind patterns, noting the subtle changes in the sand, trusting his instincts even when her own senses screamed that they were lost as the day wore on. Eliza began to notice the small things about him, how he paused at each step, listening for the slightest rustle or whisper of movement, how his eyes seemed to take in everything, the curve of a distant dune, the shimmer of heat over the sand, the faint tracks of animals long gone, how he carried a quiet patience, never rushing her, never chastising her for faltering. And then, when the sun hung high and merciless, he stopped suddenly. She almost stumbled into him as he knelt, placing a hand on the ground, pressing it into the sand. "Water," he said. "Close. Not much, but it will keep us alive." Following his instructions, she helped him lift a heavy stone, revealing a small spring, its water dark and cool against her parched lips. She drank deeply, letting the liquid revive her spirit as much as her body. He drank sparingly, watching her with a steady gaze that made her heart pound in ways she didn't understand. Sitting beside him, the desert stretching endlessly around them, Eliza felt a shift within herself. She realized that she was no longer just a traveler fleeing the storm, she was a witness to something remarkable, someone extraordinary in the midst of hardship. He had saved her life, yes, but more than that. He had offered her a glimpse of trust, courage, and the possibility that some connections could endure even the harshest trials. When she looked at him, silhouetted against the setting sun, she found herself silently asking the question she couldn't yet voice aloud. Could someone who saved your life also change it forever? And though neither of them spoke it, both understood, in the quiet language of shared experience and unspoken promise, that this journey through the dunes was only the beginning, and that whatever lay ahead would test not only their survival, but the fragile bond forming between them. The desert grew quieter as the sun dipped behind the distant dunes, painting the horizon in streaks of crimson and gold. Eliza's body ached, every muscle stiff from the long hours of walking, but the cool air of evening brought relief and renewed energy. The Apache warrior walked beside her, alert and vigilant, his dark eyes scanning the desert with an intensity that made her uneasy yet strangely reassured. Though they had been together only a short time, she felt the weight of his protection as though it were a tangible shield around her as they followed the faint trail to a hidden oasis he had promised. Eliza's thoughts drifted to the life she had left behind. She wondered if anyone would notice her absence or if she had disappeared entirely into the vastness of the desert. Her fear of being lost forever was softened slightly by his presence, but even so, a nagging sense of vulnerability remained. She realized that survival depended not just on water or shelter, but on vigilance, trust, and she whispered the word only to herself, courage. Suddenly, a low sound reached their ears, a faint rustle carried on the wind, almost imperceptible, yet enough to make the warrior stiffen. His hand went instinctively to the bow slung across his back. Eliza froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Stay close," he whispered. His voice was calm, but the tension in his posture told her all she needed to know. They moved carefully toward a small ridge, using the uneven dunes as cover. Peering over, the warrior's sharp gaze caught the movement of several figures approaching from the horizon. Bandits, their intentions clear from the weapons they carried and the predatory way they moved. Eliza's pulse raced. She had imagined the desert was dangerous, but this was something tangible, immediate. Her instinct screamed to run, but the warrior's steady hand on her shoulder held her in place. "We cannot outrun them," he said quietly. "We must be clever, or they will catch us before the night falls." With a series of silent gestures, he guided her into the shadow of a dune. She crouched low, the coarse sand biting at her palms, and watched as the bandits passed nearby. The tension in her chest made it difficult to breathe, yet she clung to his movements, following his lead with growing trust. Once the danger had passed, the warrior exhaled, a long, controlled breath that betrayed little of the adrenaline coursing through him. He looked at her then, his gaze steady, almost piercing. "You must learn to trust me," he said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. "Alone, you are vulnerable. Together, we are stronger than anything this desert throws at us." Eliza's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to tell him that she already trusted him more than she could explain, but no words came. Instead, she simply nodded, the gesture carrying the weight of her gratitude and her growing reliance on him. Night fell, and the desert transformed into a sea of shadows and silver light under the moon. The warrior led her to the oasis, a hidden refuge surrounded by palm trees and the soft trickle of water. Here they could rest safely, hidden from the prying eyes of those who would harm them. As Eliza drank deeply from the spring, her body finally beginning to recover, she noticed the quiet strength in the way he observed the surroundings, always alert, never allowing her to feel completely at ease. Yet in that same alertness, there was a strange tenderness, an unspoken promise that he would protect her at any cost. Sitting beside him under the moonlight, she felt a complex tangle of emotions: relief, admiration, curiosity, and a whisper of something else she could not name. The desert had been cruel, unyielding, but it had also brought her to him, to the man who had saved her life and refused to let her face the dangers of the world alone. In that quiet night, the bond between them deepened, forged by shared survival and the silent understanding that the trials ahead would be even greater. And though the desert stretched endlessly around them, filled with unseen threats and uncertainties, Eliza felt for the first time in her life that she was not truly alone. The Apache warrior glanced at her, and though he said nothing, the message was clear. No matter what dangers lay ahead, he would not let her go, not now, not ever. The night at the oasis was quiet, but it held a weight of unspoken tension. The soft rustle of palm leaves and the gentle trickle of water offered a fragile comfort, Yet Eliza couldn't shake the awareness that the desert outside was still vast, harsh, and unyielding. She had survived the storm and the bandits, but her mind kept returning to the moments when her life had hung in the balance, and how effortlessly the Apache warrior had saved her. The thought filled her with gratitude, but also an unfamiliar restlessness, a feeling that perhaps she owed more than just her life to this mysterious man. He had set up a small camp beside the spring, using branches and palm fronds to create a modest shelter. He moved with quiet precision, his every action deliberate, as if nothing could escape his notice. Even in the flickering firelight, his features were sharp and unreadable, yet there was a warmth in his eyes whenever they met hers. Eliza found herself studying him, noticing details she had overlooked before, the way his hands, calloused from years of work and survival, moved with careful efficiency, the way his eyes scanned every movement, every shadow, and the occasional softness in his gaze when he looked at her. "You need rest," he said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. His voice was calm, yet carried an authority that brooked no argument. "Your body will not last another day in the sun if you do not recover." Eliza nodded, but her mind resisted sleep. There was too much she wanted to say, too much she wanted to understand. I don't even know your name," she admitted softly, almost embarrassed by the admission. He paused, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart quicken. "Names are not always necessary," he said after a moment. "What matters is the bond between us now, the fact that I saved your life, and now I walk with you." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight she could feel in her chest. She realized that she had been thinking of him only as her rescuer, but he was more than that. He was a presence, a guardian, a guide, and she suspected someone who had begun to matter to her in ways she had not yet fully understood. For a while, they simply sat by the fire, the night pressing in around them. The stars above were brilliant and sharp, their cold light reflecting off the water and sand. The desert had shifted from a place of fear to a space of tentative safety, a realm where trust could take root. Eliza found herself sharing small fragments of her life, hesitant at first, yet compelled by the quiet strength beside her. She spoke of her family, her journey, the fear she had felt when she realized she might never escape the storm. He listened without interruption, his gaze unwavering, giving her the courage to continue. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shared a fragment of his own life. Not much, just enough to reveal the man behind the warrior, the boy who had learned to survive in a harsh land, the one who had watched over others out of duty and a sense of honor. She listened, captivated, as if hearing these words made the desert around them shrink, made their shared solitude more intimate, more profound. As the night deepened, the bond between them became something tangible. Trust had begun to take shape, a fragile but unbreakable connection formed through survival, shared danger, and the quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence. Eliza realized that she no longer feared being alone in the desert, not as long as he was near. Finally, exhaustion claimed her, and she allowed herself to sleep, trusting him implicitly to watch over her. And though the desert still held danger and uncertainty, in that quiet oasis, something remarkable had begun, a bond that went beyond gratitude, beyond survival, and into something neither of them could yet name, but both would feel for the rest of their lives. The Apache warrior watched her sleep, the firelight casting shadows across his face. There was a tension in his posture, a careful balance of vigilance and something else, care, something deeper than duty. In that silent night, he made a vow to himself. He would not let her go, not to the desert, not to fate, not to anyone. The life he had saved had become more than an obligation. It had become a promise. And so, under the cold, vast sky of the desert, two souls began their tentative journey toward a connection neither had expected. bound by trust, danger, and the shared memory of survival. Dawn broke over the desert in a blaze of pale gold and soft pink, spilling light across the rippling dunes. Eliza woke with the sensation of sand beneath her fingers and the sound of the oasis water trickling gently nearby. Her body felt stronger than it had the day before, though the ache of yesterday's exertion lingered in every joint. As she stirred, the Apache warrior was already awake, kneeling by the spring and examining the horizon with his sharp, unwavering gaze. "You rested well?" he asked, his voice low but steady, not looking at her directly. "Yes," she replied, stretching cautiously. "Better than I have in days." He nodded, finally turning toward her, the sunlight catching the edges of his features and casting his face in a mixture of shadow and warmth. There was something reassuring about the way he moved, so deliberate, so certain, that she felt as though the desert itself had chosen him as her guardian. They packed their sparse belongings, the oasis offering only a brief respite before the desert reclaimed its harsh dominion. Eliza noticed the intensity in his eyes as he scanned the horizon again. His instincts were honed, his senses attuned to the slightest movement, and she knew better than to question his choices. She followed closely, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and dependence that unsettled her, yet comforted her at the same time. Hours into their trek, the desert seemed unusually quiet. The wind had stilled, and the heat pressed against them, relentless in its weight. Suddenly, the warrior halted, holding up a hand. Eliza froze instinctively, sensing the tension radiating from him. "They're here," he murmured, his eyes narrowing. From the ridge ahead, a group of mounted bandits appeared, their dust-choked silhouettes signaling danger. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt the familiar surge of fear she had tried to suppress. But this time, the warrior didn't hesitate. He positioned himself between her and the approaching threat, his stance protective, every muscle coiled and ready. "You stay close to me," he ordered. "Do exactly as I say, and you will be safe." Eliza nodded, her voice caught in her throat, but she trusted him completely. They had survived the storm, the exhaustion, and the first threat together, and she had learned that his judgment was honoring. The bandits closed in, shouting and waving weapons, confident in their advantage. But the warrior moved with calculated precision, using the dunes as cover, guiding Eliza to crouch low and keeping them both hidden from the enemy's view. With every gesture, he conveyed a quiet command: trust him, follow him, survive. A tense silence hung over the desert as the bandits scouted the terrain. Then, with a sudden and deliberate motion, the warrior struck swift, precise, and efficient. He disarmed one of the bandits, sending him sprawling into the sand, while the others faltered, unsure of the attack. In moments, the fight was over. The bandits, realizing they had underestimated him, retreated, leaving the desert once again quiet, save for the ragged breathing of the two survivors. Eliza's knees trembled, not from the exertion, but from the sheer adrenaline and awe. You saved me again," she whispered, the words almost lost in the wind. He looked at her, his expression calm yet intense. "I will keep you safe," he said simply, "no matter what." There was something in that promise, something more than duty or honor. It was a declaration, quiet but absolute, and it resonated deep within her. She realized with a mixture of fear and longing that the warrior had become more than a guardian. He was a constant in a world that had threatened to consume her, a tether to safety in something she couldn't yet name but felt growing inside her heart. As they resumed their journey through the dunes, the bond between them felt stronger, forged in danger and cemented by trust. The desert had tested them, and both had survived, but they knew this was only the beginning. The challenges ahead would demand more courage, more reliance on one another. And perhaps, though neither could yet admit it, more of the hearts they had begun to place in each other's hands. The sun climbed higher, and the desert stretched endlessly before them. Yet for the first time, Eliza felt a flicker of hope amid the harshness, a hope born not from the promise of safety alone, but from the man who had saved her life and refused to let go. After the bandits retreated, the desert fell silent once more. The oasis they had left behind was now a distant memory, replaced by a vast stretch of sand and jagged rock formations. Eliza's legs ached, her body sore from both exhaustion and the adrenaline of the recent confrontation. Yet there was a quiet strength she had not felt before, a sense that, with the warrior beside her, she could endure almost anything. The Apache led them to a sheltered canyon where the heat of the day was softened by shadows and the distant echo of a hidden stream. They settled there, using rocks and sparse brush to form a small, protected camp. Eliza watched him move with calm precision, every action deliberate, almost meditative. There was a rhythm to his movements that spoke of years spent surviving in harsh lands, a quiet confidence that both intimidated and fascinated her. "You move like you know this land better than anyone," she said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was tentative, as though speaking might shatter the fragile trust between them. He paused, glancing at her briefly. "I know it because I had to," he said, his tone steady, almost flat. "Every day I learn its dangers and its secrets. Every day it teaches me survival." Eliza nodded, sensing that he was sharing only a fraction of himself. "You've saved my life more than once," she murmured. I don't even know how to repay you." He turned to face her fully this time, and for the first time she noticed the faint lines around his eyes, the weight of experience pressed into his expression. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "Your life. That was never a debt. It was a choice. I chose to save you because it was right." Her chest tightened. There was something in his voice, something deeper than duty, deeper than honor. She realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, that this man had not only risked his life for her, but had also silently carried the burden of protecting her in ways she could barely comprehend. For a while, they simply sat in silence, the canyon walls casting long shadows as the sun moved across the sky. Eliza felt the courage to ask the question that had been lingering in her mind since their first encounter. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why did you risk so much for someone you barely knew?" He looked at her then, and for the first time there was a flicker of vulnerability in his gaze. "Because sometimes when you see someone in danger, you can't turn away," he admitted. "But because once you save a life, you carry it with you. You can't forget it. You can't let go." The words struck her like a quiet thunderclap. She understood then that the bond between them was no longer just about survival. It was about connection, about memory, about an unspoken promise that transcended words. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, an unfamiliar sensation that mingled gratitude, admiration, and something she dared not name. The afternoon waned, and as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the Apache moved to gather firewood. Eliza watched him, noting the care in his movements, the attention to detail, the protective instinct that never wavered. She wanted to speak, to bridge the growing gap between gratitude and something deeper, yet the words seemed trapped in her throat. Instead, she allowed herself to simply observe, to learn from him, to feel his presence as a steady anchor in a world that had been so unpredictable. That night, as they sat together under the stars, the desert alive with nocturnal sounds, Eliza finally spoke again. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted softly, "but I know that I trust you." The warrior's gaze softened, and though he said nothing, the unspoken understanding between them was clear. Trust had been given, and in return he would remain steadfast. Their journey through the desert was far from over. Yet in this moment of quiet vulnerability, they had found something stronger than fear, stronger than danger, a connection that neither time nor distance could sever. And as the fire crackled and the stars wheeled overhead, Eliza realized that the man who had saved her life had begun to occupy a place in her heart that she could never forget, and perhaps, she thought with a mixture of awe and apprehension, that he could never let go of her either. The desert sun rose like molten gold, bathing the dunes in a harsh light that offered no comfort. Eliza and the Apache warrior had traveled further than she had ever imagined possible, yet the journey ahead promised even more danger. The canyon they had rested in the previous night now seemed a distant memory, replaced by a landscape of jagged rocks and rolling sand, where shadows twisted unpredictably and every ridge seemed to conceal a threat. Eliza's muscles ached, her body fatigued, but her resolve had strengthened alongside her trust in him. She had learned to rely on his instincts, his knowledge of the land, and his unwavering vigilance. Yet she sensed today would be different. Today would test not only their endurance, but the bond that had begun to form between them. They had barely crossed a narrow pass when a sudden plume of dust appeared on the horizon. The Apache's eyes narrowed immediately, scanning the heat-shimmered distance. "They've found us," he muttered, his voice tense yet controlled. The bandits from before had tracked them, relentless in their pursuit. Eliza's heart raced, fear gnawing at her chest. She had trusted him to guide her safely, and now the reality of danger returned with a sharper edge. The warrior's hand found hers instinctively, not as a gesture of affection, but as an anchor. "Stay close. Do exactly as I say," he ordered, his voice a steady force amidst her rising panic. They ducked behind a rocky outcrop, the sun casting long shadows that provided temporary concealment. Eliza crouched low, her pulse pounding as she watched the bandits approach. Their shouts carried faintly on the wind. The Apache's strategy was precise. He used the terrain to their advantage, directing her to move silently, teaching her how to anticipate danger and respond without hesitation. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the careful rustling of sand beneath their feet. Each encounter with the bandits tested Eliza's resolve, forcing her to confront her own fears and limitations. The warrior never left her side, yet he demanded her participation, guiding her while expecting her to act. Slowly, she discovered a strength within herself. She had never known resilience born not only of necessity but of trust in the man who had saved her life. At one critical moment, a bandit spotted them and fired a shot. The Apache reacted instantly, pushing her to the ground and leaping to intercept the attacker. The sound of gunfire and clashing metal filled the canyon as he fought with a lethal grace, protecting her with every ounce of skill and instinct he possessed. Eliza watched, heart in her throat, as he defended them both, her fear mingling with awe. He was more than a warrior, he was a guardian, whose presence could mean the difference between life and death. When the bandits finally fled, realizing they could not overcome him, silence returned to the canyon. Eliza trembled, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving exhaustion and a profound sense of gratitude in its wake. She turned to him, searching his face for reassurance, for some sign that he was unharmed. He met her gaze, his eyes dark and steady, a faint shadow of a smile touching his lips. "You are safe," he said simply. "For now." The words were simple, yet they carried a promise, an unspoken vow that he would never let harm come to her as long as he could prevent it. In that moment, Eliza realized that their connection had evolved beyond a mere survival. She no longer saw him only as her protector, but as someone who understood the fragility and value of life, and someone whose presence had become essential to her own sense of being. As they moved on, The desert around them seemed less threatening, though danger was far from gone. The trial of fire they had endured together had solidified a bond that neither could ignore. Trust had deepened into something stronger, an unspoken understanding. A tether between hearts forged in the crucible of danger. Eliza glanced at him as they navigated the rugged terrain, her chest tight with emotion. He had saved her again, not just from the desert or the bandits, but from the vulnerability and fear that had threatened to overwhelm her. And she knew, with quiet certainty, that he would never let her go, not now. Not ever. Night fell over the desert like a velvet curtain, softening the harsh lines of the dunes and turning the jagged rocks into silhouettes against the silver glow of the moon. Eliza and the Apache warrior had made camp near a small, hidden depression where the wind was gentler and the night air cooler. The events of the day, the relentless pursuit of the bandits, the near misses, the constant tension left both of them exhausted, yet strangely alive. Survival had forged a bond between them that words could barely capture, and for the first time, silence felt comfortable rather than oppressive. Eliza sat cross-legged by the small fire, watching him as he tended to a minor wound on his forearm. She noticed the way his jaw tightened slightly when he applied the salve, the careful precision in every movement, and the quiet patience that defined him. He was always calm, always in control, yet she sensed the weight of his vigilance and responsibility pressing down on him, as though every step they took demanded more than just physical endurance. She began, hesitating as if the words themselves carried great risk. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like I owe you more than my life. Her voice wavered, unsteady, betraying the vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. He glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper, something she could not yet name. You owe me nothing, he said quietly. I chose to save you because it was right, because it was necessary. Not for gratitude, not for repayment. Eliza's gaze fell to the fire, the warmth contrasting with the chill of the desert night. It's more than that, she whispered. It's the way you've stayed with me. The way you've never let me face anything alone. I don't know if I've ever trusted anyone like this before. He remained silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. Then, almost imperceptibly, he moved closer, though still maintaining the space between them that neither wanted to disrupt too soon. Trust, he said finally, his voice low and steady, is not given lightly. You have earned it, and I will never let it be misplaced. Her chest tightened. There was a weight to his words, a gravity that went beyond survival or duty. It was as though he was acknowledging not only the bond formed through danger, but also the unspoken emotions that had begun to grow between them. She realized then that she was no longer merely grateful for his protection, she was drawn to him, pulled by a force she had not anticipated, one that mingled awe, admiration, and something far more intimate. For the first time, the Apache warrior spoke of his own feelings cautiously, as if testing the fragile ground between them. When I saved you, he began, I did not know what it would mean. I thought only of keeping you alive. But now, I cannot imagine letting you go. Not to the desert, not to anyone, not even to fate itself. Eliza felt her heart constrict at his words. The desert, the storms, the dangers they had faced, it all seemed to converge in this quiet confession. A moment suspended in time where the harsh world beyond the dunes felt distant, almost unreal. She wanted to speak, to tell him she felt the same, yet the vulnerability made her hesitate. Instead, she reached out, her hand brushing against his. The touch was tentative, but deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been growing for days, forged in survival, trust, and shared danger. He did not pull away. Instead, his hand covered hers, firm and reassuring, a promise without words. And in that simple gesture, Both understood the truth that neither had yet dared to speak aloud. The life he had saved had become intertwined with his heart, just as her own had become irrevocably tied to him. The desert stretched endlessly around them, vast and unyielding, yet in that moment it seemed to shrink into insignificance. The dangers of the past, the uncertainty of the future, they all faded into the background of the quiet night. All that mattered was the bond between them, fragile yet unbreakable, and the knowledge that neither could nor would ever let go. As the fire dwindled and the stars wheeled overhead, Eliza leaned slightly closer, and he allowed her to, both feeling the unspoken confession settle like a gentle promise between them. The desert had tested them, shaped them, and in its harshest trials it had forged a connection neither could deny. The desert had grown harsh once more, the midday sun casting blinding heat across the endless dunes. Eliza and the Apache warrior had traveled far since their quiet night at the oasis, but the desert was never forgiving. Their journey had been long, testing their endurance, patience, and trust in one another. Yet neither could have predicted the danger that now loomed, a danger that would demand not only courage but a complete reliance on the bond they had spent days forging from a distant ridge. Dust clouds signaled the approach of bandits larger in number than before and clearly emboldened by their previous encounters. The warrior's eyes darkened, scanning the horizon with a precise focus that left no detail unnoticed. He did not speak immediately, but the tension radiating from him was palpable. Every instinct, every movement, every line of his body signaled readiness for the confrontation that was about to erupt. Eliza's chest tightened. She had learned to trust him implicitly, yet the sight of so many adversaries threatened to overwhelm her. She took a deep breath, recalling the nights spent by firelight and the shared moments of vulnerability. In those memories, she found a steadying courage. She would not falter, not now, not when he needed her as much as she needed him. "They're more than we can outrun," he murmured. "We face them together." They moved swiftly to higher ground, using the dunes as cover, positioning themselves where the rocky terrain offered an advantage. Eliza's heart pounded, but she followed his instructions with precise care, crouching low, moving silently, and trusting his every signal. The warrior was a storm of efficiency and precision, his movements fluid and lethal. Yet every action was calculated to protect her. The bandits advanced, shouting and brandishing their weapons, but the warrior remained unyielding. Using the terrain to his advantage, he created barriers and distractions, guiding Eliza behind rocks and into shadowed areas. She realized how much she had grown in just a few days. Her fear still lingered, but it no longer paralyzed her. She was learning, adapting, surviving alongside him. At the crucial moment, a bandit broke through their cover and aimed a shot at Eliza. In an instant, the warrior was between them, intercepting the attack with a swift movement that left Eliza breathless. The desert echoed with the sounds of the confrontation. Shouts, the clash of steel, the whistle of arrows. Through it all, the warrior remained her shield, his determination unwavering, his strength unrelenting. Finally, after what felt like hours compressed into moments of sheer intensity, the bandits retreated. Exhaustion hung over both of them, their breathing ragged, bodies bruised and scorched by the desert sun. Yet the danger had passed, and they stood together, victorious, bonded more deeply than ever before. Eliza looked at him, her chest tight with gratitude, admiration, and a burgeoning awareness of her own heart. You saved me again," she whispered, her voice trembling. He met her gaze, and in that moment the stoic warrior's armor seemed to soften. "Always," he said quietly. "I will never let you go. Not now, not ever." The desert, vast and indifferent, stretched endlessly around them, yet in that moment It felt small and intimate, a world defined not by danger, but by the bond between two souls forged in survival and shared trials. Eliza felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, a mixture of relief, awe, and a deep, unshakable affection for the man who had become her protector, her guide, and she realized, the keeper of her heart died as they walked together away from the battlefield. The desert no longer seemed cruel. Its trials had been harsh, but they had shaped a connection that neither time nor distance could sever. And in the silence between them, filled only with the sound of wind and shifting sand, a promise lingered unspoken but absolute. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, bound by life, by trust, and by the unyielding certainty that neither could ever let go of the other. The desert stretched endlessly before them, calm now after the chaos of the final confrontation. The bandits had fled, their threats silenced, leaving only the wind, the dunes, and the golden light of late afternoon. Eliza walked beside the Apache warrior, her steps slow but steady, her body weary yet alive in a way she had never felt before. Every muscle ached, but the ache was a reminder of survival, of trials endured, and of the bond that had carried them through each danger. They reached a quiet plateau overlooking a vast canyon below. The sun cast long shadows across the sand, bathing the world in a warm, amber glow. For a long moment, neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary. Their shared experiences, their struggles, and their growing connection filled the space between them more completely than any conversation could. Finally, Eliza turned to him, her voice soft but resolute. "I don't think I could have survived any of this without you," she admitted. "Not the storm, not the desert, not the bandits. Not any of it." He looked at her, his expression steady, unwavering. "And I would not have let you," he said quietly. "I promised that from the first moment I saved your life, and I meant it. You are not alone, not now, not ever." Her chest tightened, the weight of those words settling over her like a blanket. She realized then that the bond they had forged in the crucible of danger had grown into something more profound, a connection not just of survival, but of heart and soul. She trusted him completely, and in that trust, she found courage she never knew she had. He stepped closer, the wind tousling his dark hair, his eyes reflecting the last light of the sun. "I have walked many paths in this desert," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "I have faced dangers, storms, and death itself. But never have I carried someone's life as carefully as I carry yours. You have become a part of me, as I am a part of you. And I cannot and will not let that go." Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes, a mixture of relief, awe, and something deeper, something that went beyond gratitude or admiration. Her hand reached for his, and he took it without hesitation, the warmth of his touch steadying her trembling heart. "Then I won't let you go either," she whispered. "Not now, not ever." For a moment, they simply stood there, hands entwined, the desert stretching out around them like a silent witness to their promises. The dangers they had faced, storms, exhaustion, bandits, and the merciless desert itself were behind them, but the connection they had forged remained unbroken and unyielding. In the vast emptiness, they had found each other, and in that discovery lay a sense of peace neither had anticipated. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in shades of violet and crimson. The wind softened, carrying the scent of distant blooms and the promise of another day. They began to walk together again, side by side, their steps in harmony, their hearts bound by experiences that could never be erased. Eliza glanced at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Do you remember me, Apache?" she asked softly, the words carrying both the memory of their first meeting and the journey that had followed. He turned toward her, eyes dark and steady, a faint smile touching his lips. "I will never forget you," he said. the life I saved, and the woman I could never let go. That is you." And with those words, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The trials, the danger, and the endless miles behind them had led to this moment, a connection forged in survival, strengthened by trust, and sealed with a promise neither would ever break. Together, they walked into the fading light, the desert stretching endlessly ahead, but now a place of shared strength, unwavering trust, and an unshakable bond that would endure beyond the horizon. In the vast, unforgiving desert, they had found something eternal, each other, and neither would ever let go.